This is our Building a Resilient Guilford County planning session number 4. So our final planning session. Hey, Ashlyn, we're glad you're here as well. So once again, if you guys want to just quickly in the chat, write who's here. We'd love to see what agency you're with. And welcome to planning session number 4. So if you guys want to go, I think, Kelly, are you running the slides? If you want to go ahead and go to the agenda, I can start that so we can be mindful of time. All right, guys, welcome. Thank you. I love to see so many people here and love to hear where you're from. And once again, thank you for joining us for our planning session number 4. And today we've got quite a bit to pack into the hour and we want to hear from everyone. So we are going to go quickly through our progress to date, getting grounded, what building a resilient North Carolina looks like, where we've been, where we're going. We're going to go into the breakout groups, which we've done at every session, but this time we're going to focus on action teams and what action teams are needed. And then we'll go into what's next and what the next steps are going to be. So again, I'm Melanie Garner and I'm with the CRI team at Kellen, and I want to just welcome everyone. And if you're just joining us and you missed it, I'd love to know who's here. So if you can just put your name and agency in the chat, that would be fantastic. And I am going to pass it to Mary.
Good afternoon, everyone. So delighted that we are all back together again on this first day of December, if we can believe that. So happy December, and we're going to go ahead and just take a look at where we've been as the Resilient Guilford Network in our planning so far. So we are an action-oriented trauma and resiliency network of systems and collaborative leaders that promote safe, secure, and nurturing environments for all, and draw on interconnected social networks and coordinated, easy to access and comprehensive resources that help communities within Guilford County thrive. This is a definition that we actually came to as a group, and really grateful for the input that you created and made in terms of organizing what this group is and defining it. So we're working at both the community level and systems level to make sure that communities within Guilford County can respond and adapt to stresses and challenges. So if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to just give a little overview of where we've been. This will look familiar if you were with us at the last meeting. So we started our planning in September. And started thinking about what the characteristics look like of a resilient community and what our community would look like if we were in fact resilient. We started talking about how to define community resilience and the values that will guide the work and how we'll work together as a network. And also started to think about what teams and structures are needed to build a resilient Guilford County that are aligned with the collective values that we've landed on, and defining what the work of the team is. And we're going to pick up that work today in our small breakout groups. And we can move to the next slide. So during our last session, last 2 sessions, we talked a lot about values to guide our work as a collaborative, and created value statements, and we worked in small groups to hone those statements. Since that time, I just want to let everybody know that we actually gathered a small group of folks to work on a few more of these, and the invitation was put out to folks in smaller groups to come back together. So what you're seeing today is that work of our last breakout groups during the November meeting, and then some work in the interim to take your feedback into account and make sure that it's built in. So I'd invite you to spend a minute looking at the values and value statements of where we are right now. You'll also notice that they've been put into an active format to talk about the collective itself. So you'll see a lot of we statements, and that means all of us together. Leland is going to put these, our trustee partner, into the chat as well so that you can take a look at them. So I'll give, why don't we take 20 seconds to read through this on the screen. And we'd ask for your feedback in the chat as well during this meeting. And we'll have opportunities to continue as we work together to refine these value statements. But these are the basis of how we're going to work together going forward. And Leland, if we can move, I don't want to read these to the group, and we'll send these out after. If we could move to the next one. And again, you can look in the chat and see all of the definitions and statements as they exist right now. So on the screen right now, you see family voice-centered and client-led, data-driven while applying a trauma-informed lens, and bias toward action. Most of the rewriting happened with the first two of the statements, which were around trust, transparency, and accountability, and equity and inclusion with diverse representation. And thanks for moving it ahead. So we see collaboration, relationship and strengths focused, and joy and celebration. Just want to give the opportunity to open up the lines if anyone has any reactions, additional feedback that you have about any of the values and value statements that we've shared in so far today. And you can open your line, or we can watch for your comments in chat. Any comments to share? Maybe one of the most important ones is, are these values and value statements reflective of what you believe our work to be as we move forward? Okay, I see some affirmations. Thanks, Ashlyn, for jumping in, and Hannah. Yeah, at the last meeting, you all did such fantastic work at crafting and recrafting. I'm looking at you, Charlene, and remember your report outs, and just grateful for that. Okay, any feedback? And you'll have the opportunity to continue to weigh in as we lead this work. But one of the things that we're going to do is make sure that we ground this work in these values and value statements going forward. So this is an accountability opportunity for all of us. I'm seeing collaboration value really resonates with our work, and a couple of other comments about the values looking great. Yep, kudos to everyone. Kelly put a comment in about all of the brainstorming that you've done, and continuing to send feedback. Okay, so we will move, and this deck will be sent to everybody after this meeting as well. And so please continue to weigh in as Kelly suggested. As we move forward, and we're going to have some additional time in small groups later today, but we wanted to bring to your attention, I'm delighted that Kelly's going to share with us today, a report and a summary of a report that we've talked about called Resilient NC. And this is really, this was supported by the Weiner Foundation, Family Foundation. And there are lots of efforts across the state to build community resilience. And then this report basically looks at what it would take to build a statewide effort. And so I think it's really important as we're thinking about action teams to learn about this work at the state level so that we can align where it's appropriate, change course as needed as well. But we want to make sure that this is in everybody's back pocket and everyone has this information before we break into our groups to talk about action teams. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who will take it from here.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Again, as Mary said, I'm just going to give you a really high-level overview of a report called Resilient NC. And the goal of this project was really looking at resiliency-related work across the state and how do we better align for bigger collective impact. And so as we're thinking about how we do that even in Guilford County, the thought is to give a high-level overview of what the state is looking at in case that informs our work in Guilford County. And so we wanted just to give you an overview of this work in case it's helpful. Just as some grounding pieces, the state also is looking at community resilience. And so just as a recap, community resilience is focusing on work at the community and systems level. So while we recognize that individual and family resilience are key to healthy communities, this particular project is focusing on community level and systems level resilience. And so we know from the science that resilience is built. That's even the case in our systems and community work. We know that to be the case there too. And there's many layers of resilience, as I just mentioned. And the other thing that we know across the state and across the country and from the science is that it's not necessarily like we focus on trauma or we focus on resilience. There's a growing understanding that we need to do both. We need to address the trauma to prevent and intervene and build resilience. And so for those in the field, protective factors and how do we build the positives while we're also addressing and trying to prevent the negatives. So really taking a both and approach to the work. So with that being said, we underwent a series of interviews that I'll talk about in just a minute, but in terms of why now, there's so much momentum. I'm sure everyone on the call has heard about the trauma-informed care and resilience and toxic stress and brain development and all the different layers and pieces, which is a good thing. There's so much momentum that's happening around trauma-informed care, which is really exciting to see, having been in this field now for a couple decades, that there's so much momentum happening now. But I think we also know that with so much momentum, it's really, really essential to align that momentum and to coordinate that work so that we don't unintentionally create more confusion or dilute the impact that we could have because of lack of coordination and communication. And so the pandemic, I think, has further laid bare the fact that this work is needed and that stress, the impact that stress and traumatic stress in particular can have on the body, and how to counter that with resiliency focused efforts. So in particular, the statewide work for Resilient NC really had the high level question of how does our state intentionally coordinate a way of working together across the state, across initiatives to build community resilience across the lifespan. And so that was our task, is to identify some strategies on how to do that. So in order to tackle that, we looked at multiple different pieces of the puzzle. We wanted to know what's already happening in terms of resiliency work, so kind of a landscape overview of resiliency related initiatives in North Carolina. The thought is once we have that, we can better connect individuals across the state, individuals, organizations, and systems across the state so that people can be in better communication with each other and coordinate the work more closely. And that this would also lead to kind of a statewide centralized source of information that can be used so that places in Asheville can learn from places in Fayetteville and Raleigh and Charlotte and Guilford and et cetera, that we can learn from each other and not reinvent the wheel. So that was the goal. That was what we were tasked with accomplishing. And in order to do that, we conducted a long series of statewide interviews. And at the same time, our task was also to coordinate and understand better what's happening on the national scene. So in addition to understanding the North Carolina landscape, we talked to over a dozen states across the country and state leaders across the country about how they rolled out statewide initiatives, what worked, what didn't, lessons learned, what they wish they would have known at the beginning when they were rolling out collaborative initiatives to inform our strategies across the state in North Carolina. And we were tasked with developing from the information we learned in North Carolina and the information we learned from across the country, we were tasked with developing a set of recommendations to guide, to potentially guide North Carolina on how to build resilience across our state. So that resulted in a very comprehensive report. And so we'll put the links in the chat box here in just a minute, but the report is all interactive and hyperlinked. The format of it, the way it's structured is there's an executive summary and a set of recommendations that you can pull out from the report for kind of quick Cliff Notes version, so to speak. And then it's sectioned off. So the first section is all of the North Carolina interviews and initiatives that are happening in our state. And then the next section are summaries of initiatives that are happening across our country by state. So we can look, you can kind of pull it out by, if you wanted to pull out Utah and see what Utah is doing, you can kind of pull that out and take a peek at it, et cetera. So it's meant to be used as a working document, an interactive document that you can pull out pieces based on what you would like to dive deeper into. And at the end of the document, there's also at a glance glossaries. So for example, maybe you're interested in what initiatives have really focused on strategic communications. So there's a glossary in the back that shows you the states that have done really significant work in that area that you could quick reference. So the report is meant to be as useful and interactive as possible. We won't have time today to go over all of the different findings. So just giving you a really high level overview. In North Carolina, these are the initiatives we talked to across the state. We conducted intensive interviews and also did follow-up reading and communications with each of these teams in North Carolina to understand the landscape of their initiative and what they were working on. Profiles of each of these North Carolina partners are in the report. And in addition, across the country, the states on the left, California on down, have intensive reports with interviews and hyperlinks of their statewide efforts. And what we did is ask the question, who else do we need to talk to? And that led us down a lot of additional rows. And for time's sake, we weren't able to get to all of the who else we need to talk to. However, on the right-hand side, with Alaska down, we do have information about each of these states. It's just not quite as detailed as the core one, starting with California down. So there's information and hyperlinks and high-level overviews of these additional states as well. I would encourage you to take a peek at them if you're interested in learning about this work across the country. And we also looked at some national resources. So we partnered with the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, the ACE Resource Network, PACES Connection, which are all national groups doing this work. And then we also examined some work in Canada that has done really groundbreaking stuff around trauma and resilience. So they're highlighted in the report as well. So what I'm going to do today with the remaining time that I have is just kind of skip over the profiles, because again, you can pull those out and look at those in detail and really spend the majority of the time on the 8-point strategy that was developed as a result of the North Carolina interviews and the interviews across the country. So this is a graphic that highlights this 8-point strategy. And what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about each of the strategies. With the idea being that in order to build resiliency, it's going to take more than one type of strategy or approach to do it. There are multiple ways and multiple pieces, kind of like making your outfit. You put your shoes on, you put your shirt on, you put your pants on, you put your hat on, your glasses, etc. So how do we build this initiative so that we have all of the pieces to make it the most impactful that we can? So let's start with the first recommendation, which is backbone support. What we found across the interviews in North Carolina, as well as across the country, is that the states that demonstrated the most success have identified a backbone agency to help drive the work. This was also lifted up in our North Carolina interviews as well, in terms of how helpful it would be to have a backbone agency. And for clarity, what we mean by backbone agency is not someone to drive all of the work, but to coordinate the work that's happening and to help to align efforts whenever possible. So a backbone agency might do things like staff coordinators that can help support the community. They may disseminate information to all of the partners. They may coordinate training efforts so that training can be the most impactful across agencies and across initiatives. So they're more of a coordinating body rather than necessarily doing all of the work. They are coordinating and making sure that that work is aligned across initiatives. So that is also something that North Carolina is looking at doing about how that would work in North Carolina. Currently, there's not a backbone per se in North Carolina, but in the states that have been the most successful across the country, the backbone support was one of the things that was lifted up the most as being the most helpful to move the work along in a coordinated way. There's pros and cons to how backbone agencies are structured. So part of it would be having discussion in North Carolina about what North Carolina would want for its backbone agency and how to make that happen. The second strategy, and feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go. What I'll probably do is go through the strategies and then we'll have questions at the end, just for time's sake. But so the second strategy is public awareness and strategic communication. One of the things that was lifted up is the kind of inundation of information and resources, and all of them kind of being framed in so many different ways. So one of the ideas that surfaced is to potentially have a Resilient NC centralized website hub. It could coordinate with the backbone agency or it could stand alone, but the idea being a centralized place for North Carolina related resiliency work, documents that could be accessed easily without having to do the legwork of finding those documents and potentially having different language in those documents, et cetera. So a centralized website hub that would be able to provide information in a consistent way. This could include the way we talk about trauma, the way we talk about resilience, the kinds of things that we've been talking about around the difference between community resilience and family resilience and individual resilience, and really kind of pushing those messages about common language. The website hub could also have multiple sectors or portals represented. So if you are connected with juvenile justice, there could be information that's specific for juvenile justice. If you're connected with the schools, if you're connected with reentry, depending upon your area, we could have different portals where people would be able to kind of get deeper information in their specific role or sector. But the idea being that it would also drive some cross-sector work as well. We also want to increase kind of public awareness and public understanding of resilience, what it is, what it isn't, and the ideas around trauma and toxic stress and ACEs. And so building out a public awareness campaign across the state so that what's happening now is often different counties are doing some of this work and sometimes giving different messages. So the way, one county might be talking about it is very different than another county, and it's very different from another county, which could create and drive additional confusion as we're looking at statewide efforts. And so thinking about a statewide campaign that could be rolled out across communities. Building out our social media presence. There really aren't social media channels for North Carolina on resilience. So creating a social media platform that could help to disseminate the information and the public awareness campaign messages as well could also be really beneficial, because not everyone is on their computer and website all the time, but a lot of people are on social media. And so how do we use different platforms to share similar information, right? Another idea was developing a public awareness film series that we launch and disseminate across a calendar year. Maybe we have a different like the resilience film and different films that we show periodically, combined with panels and community conversations about that work to drive action. So different ways to kind of keep the conversations going. And thinking about how we create sections on the website that are tools and tips and tools that can be used across the state. So maybe there's a resource section on press releases for Child Abuse Prevention Month. Maybe there's a section on proclamations and ideas that counties can take to get legislative involvement in their community, right? So thinking about how do we create tools that people could use and not have to write? Because what we were finding when we were talking with people in North Carolina is everyone was going down similar paths. The work was being duplicated in so many places. And there were examples of how other counties could roll out initiatives, but the communities weren't necessarily talking to each other, so they were doing double the work. So thinking about how we align more strategically. The third recommendation, and I'll speed it up because I know I'm going slow, is building public-private partnerships. So how do we cultivate public-private partnerships? This was one of the strategies that was lifted up the most across the country about that the initiatives that had these public-private partnerships in place were groups of elected officials, small businesses, nonprofits, philanthropic partners that were working together towards a common goal, really helped to move the initiative forward. And so building some public-private partnership models in North Carolina would help us to continue to move forward and also sustain that work. This could also include funding structures that help to sustain the work as well. For example, in California, they have a program called the Resilience Effect, in which they partnered with a corporation, who has a nonprofit arm that helps to fund the entire Northern California efforts of resiliency work. And so in that, how that has played out, many of you may be aware that California is a leader when it comes to addressing trauma and resilience. That Northern California work was also where the Nadine Burke Harris, that many of you may be familiar with, where she was in Northern California. It helped launch her clinic. She's now the Surgeon General in California, and there's huge momentum and change in California now on the policy level across the state. So that's just an example of how a business created a structure to support the work in one area and how it grew, right? And so building out those public-private partnerships can be critical to moving the work forward. Continued training and technical assistance was definitely lifted up. There's a lot of training and technical assistance that happens, and probably, as many of you on the phone can attest to, you think like we're further along, and then you see like, oh, this whole sector needs some work in trauma and resiliency related work. And even in our own, because we have turnover, and we have, in our own fields, we have turnover, and we have new clinicians, and we have clinicians that may have been trained 30 years ago that may not have gotten some of this information. So there's an ongoing need for training and technical assistance, and making sure that that we continue to build out opportunities for training and technical assistance across the state. So that is definitely one of the strategies. Building these cross-sector partnerships. There's so much work that's happening that's not necessarily coordinated. So I'm not saying in Guilford County, but in other parts of the state, you'll have schools that are building a training curriculum, and then you have juvenile justice that's working on an initiative, and then you have public health that's like, oh, wait a minute, they're doing that? Okay. So what we found throughout the state and throughout the country is that we need better connections across sectors when we're talking about resilience. You're on this call because you already know trauma and resilience impact people's lives in many, many different ways. And that includes many different sectors, right? So it makes sense that the sectors would work more closely together. And that just, for the most part, there's exceptions, but for the most part, that doesn't happen very easily or very regularly. And so really building out strategies for sectors to meet and discuss and work together in a more strategic way would help us with A, pushing the same messages, and B, streamlining the work, and ultimately helping the people that we're working to help the most. Strategy 6 is policy and advocacy. We definitely have some policy and advocacy work to do. So promotion of trauma-informed care policies at the local, state, and federal level. There's a lot of work happening across the state on this. Pennsylvania and California have lots of examples of this that they've said that they would share with us. We don't have to duplicate or reinvent the wheel. There are legislative executive orders that have been shared with us that we could take and tweak and push for policy and advocacy work. But it's very clear that in order to continue to make sustainable change, we also have to change policy and build opportunities to support this work and families that we're working with on an ongoing way. So for example, in that it's the Resilient NC website hub that we could have a policy section where it has examples of all of these sample policies and links to different states that have used these policies with success and contacts, those kinds of things. That's what I mean about aligning the strategic communication with the policy and like aligning these different pieces for biggest collective action without having to reinvent the wheel. Really the idea of how do we work smarter and not harder to coordinate these different pieces. This is definitely happening at the federal level now. There is a campaign for Trauma-Informed America that is growing significantly, and there's lots of policy work happening at the federal level, including the Rise from Trauma Act, which is close to passing, I'm hoping. It's really building momentum, and that Rise from Trauma Act links in with the 7th recommendation of supporting local coalitions. What we found across North Carolina and across the country is most of the time local coalitions, much like this one, go unfunded. It's usually individuals who are volunteering their time and trying to pull people together to create coalitions in their local community. It is rare to see local coalitions funded in and of themselves. And so one of the recommendations across the state that we heard from people across the state is that that's helpful, but not necessarily sustainable, particularly as the work grows. So the 7th recommendation is to look at funding structures that would support local coalition work. This is consistent with that Rise from Trauma Act that is being pushed at the federal level, which also indicates that states should support local coalitions in this work and in this effort. And the last recommendation is measurement strategies. So how do we measure the impact of what we're doing? We talk about resilience, we talk about trauma at a community level. There are actually relatively few measures of how to measure and track that over time. There are a couple out there. And so one idea is thinking about creating a community resilience measurement toolkit where we have kind of a compendium or a summary of different ways to measure community resilience that could be available for initiatives across North Carolina, including Guilford, if we choose to look at that. But thinking about how do we measure our impact? Because we know with grants and with initiatives in general, what gets measured gets done. So how do we measure what we're doing, highlight our successes, identify the areas where we need to grow, and use that for continued strengthening of local coalition work? So measurement strategies is the 8th and final strategy for this work. So you can see how those 8 strategies would go pretty, they're in line with each other and they also would complement each other. One of the things that we're pushing across the state is that although different people may align with different strategies, for example, maybe local coalition is your thing, maybe measurement and research is your thing, like you have particular passion areas or interests, every one of us falls in one of those spokes. And in terms of building the momentum, we've been pushing across the state that everyone should be a part of this, from listening to it to sharing information about it, every system, every working group, every county, every elected official, et cetera. And one of the people that we interviewed, Victor Armstrong, who's now DHS's Chief Health Equity Officer, probably said my favorite quote of all of the interviews. And he said, people can be as resilient as the resources available to them. And this really, I think, encapsulates what we're talking about with community resilience. Yes, people can be resilient at the individual level. Yes, people can be resilient at the family level, and we can have programs in place that support that, and we should, and those are important. And how do the systems and communities support people in their own individual resilience? So how do we build that as a local coalition for community change in the local level? So with that being said, again, Weiner Family Foundation provided support for this project, and we're continuing to brainstorm with them about next steps, about how to implement our next steps. There's some conversation that the 8 action teams or the 8 strategies may develop into 8 action teams. Maybe not. That's still kind of under discussion and under exploration. This report was just launched a couple weeks ago. So it's interesting because we're kind of at the same stage in North Carolina as we are in Guilford County in terms of building out the teams of what's next. And so that's why we thought it might be helpful for our local group to get a snapshot of what's happening at the state level in case that informs what we do locally. So with that being said, I will stop chatting and see if there are any questions. Feel free to come off mute if you'd like, or add to the chat box. I know I just dumped a lot of information. Any questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Well, feel free to add if you, thanks, Ashlyn, for your comments. I see them in the box, and Emily as well. Feel free to add if you have questions. I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes it'll be, like the next day I'll be like, oh, I wish I would ask that question. Feel free to reach out at any time. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I think Leland or somebody above, yep, Leland put the full report, the link to the full report on our website as well. So feel free to check it out. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton so we can start thinking about what are action teams in Guilford County? So we know kind of our values, we know our vision, we know kind of where we're going to at Guilford County. We have a snapshot now of what the state's doing. And so now we'll be moving to the next section of our agenda. And I think I passed this to, is it Mary?
I think so.
All right, there you go.
Fantastic. Kelly, thank you so much. And I was just wondering, I put this in the chat too. Could you just, what has the reaction been so far from local coalitions and from what you're hearing at the state level? Just any high level observations?
Yeah, so the reaction so far is, yeah, we need to do this and everybody wants to do this yesterday. So thinking about how we do it and how we support that work, because one of the things that's important is as we build out these strategies that we have the support that we need to execute them well. And so that's kind of where we are across the state, is continuing to disseminate the report, since it just was released a couple of weeks ago, continuing to garner support for implementation of the different strategies, and also thinking about what groups across the state are already doing work in that area. So for example, policy and advocacy. NC Child is already doing policy and advocacy work. So how do we leverage what they're already doing in the policy, that strategic recommendation? The western part of North Carolina has a very strong policy work group. How do we leverage that group and pull them into the mix? So thinking about who's already doing this work across the state, and pulling them in to potentially lead the action teams. So that kind of brainstorming is what's happening now, with the idea being that potentially those groups will be convened, and then under each strategic recommendation, we'll flush it out even further about like, how do we build, like more concretely about how do we do it, to then create an early 2023 statewide conference around resilience. So that's kind of where it's going right now. But right now we're largely in dissemination phase of the information and kind of beginning to gather statewide support of who might want to be part of each action team.
Okay, fantastic. Kelly, that's a great tee up for what we're going to do next in the breakout groups. Thank you so much for sharing this. And actually, when you started talking about policy, I saw Ebony Burnett's eyes light up. Because you have a Guilford Child Advocacy Network group right here in Guilford County too. So what we're going to do next is to do breakout groups, and each group will have a facilitator. As a group, we're going to answer these questions. So considering the Resilient Guilford Network mission, our value statements, and what we know about community need and the Resilient North Carolina work, what action teams do we need to advance the community resilience building here? What the action teams will be charged with doing? What teams and groups are already in place that we don't want to recreate? This isn't about recreating the wheel, it's about strengthening what's already happening and building more connections. Is there anything that we shouldn't do, that we should stay away from? And then who else needs to be at the table as we continue this work together? So,
and Mary, can I add one thing before we go?
Of course.
Just for framing, it might be that when you're in your action team, when you're in your breakout rooms, just because I shared those 8 strategies doesn't necessarily mean that's where we need to go. Guilford County might want to do action teams that are specific to populations, right? So we might want to do an action team around immigrant and refugee, or an action team around like a population versus a strategy. So I'm just planting that seed, because I don't want people to think that because the 8 strategies that I just presented are kind of high level, that we have to go in that direction. We could go down to population level as well. And so it really just depends on what we as a collective working group, want to build for the action teams, what we think is needed. So just wanted to plant that seed.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, Kelly, about what we know about community need and what we're seeing out there and what we're hearing every day in our daily work. So thank you so much. And so we're going to go into breakout groups now. We have 4 facilitators. We're going to ask again to do some report outs in I think we have about 15 minutes together, and then we'll do some report outs and come back together. Okay, and Leland, our magical, thank you so much. Everybody should be assigned to a breakout room. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Hi there. Hi, we're in breakout rooms now for about the next 4 minutes. Would you like me to send you to a breakout room, or do you just want to wait for everybody to come back?
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I was in a breakout room and I lost power. So I
Yeah,
had-
no problem. Do you want me to send you back to one, or do you want to just wait? It's about 3 minutes left.
I could just wait. That's fine.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm glad your power came back on.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah. Well, everybody should be coming back in just a couple minutes, so
Okay.
you can just relax.
All right, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Welcome back, everyone. Do we have everybody back in the group?
We should have everybody back. Welcome back.
Leland, thank you for working your magic, as always. Okay, we have a couple minutes left, 4 minutes left. So why don't we, it's going to be fast and furious, y'all. Can we have group number 1 start? Does everybody remember their group numbers? Ebony, I think we're group number 2.
I think we were group number 1.
Yes, we were, Charlene. Thank you.
Okay. So we really focused on talking about resources, resources for psychiatrists and youth, and mainly they gave a lot of information, population served, whether they took private insurance versus Medicaid, looking at different populations, for example, homeless families or ESL families. We talked about what should they be doing, pulling these resources together and constant updates. We talked about possibly leveraging college interns to gather the resources and distribute at the end of the semester.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlene. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Ebony, do you want to go ahead?
All right, so we focused on the action teams that we felt might be needed, and so high level. We talked about the refugee population and making sure that they had, so they were getting the support that they needed. We also talked about the advocacy. We would need someone to support the advocacy and policy change. We would need an educational team, someone to go out and educate our community and our policymakers on resiliency, and again, having that common language, starting in Guilford County. We also talked at length about a database. We need a database of resources. So could we put together a team to start, maybe we contract with someone to build a database or somehow have something where we are all communicating, making sure that families are getting the resources and that agencies are able to share these resources with families. We also talked about an easier way to communicate those resources together. A team to identify gaps in services. So where are those gaps, and making sure that we're getting those gaps. We find those gaps and we start to fill them. And a team to kind of analyze some possible opportunities for outreach. How can we connect these resources and connect these teams? And so we have all these resources. We need someone, maybe a team, an outreach team, to connect everyone, so that again, when we build that database, everyone kind of knows who everyone is. So, and last one, who's here and who needs to be here? So a team of people to, and I got to be this team, but a team of people to kind of figure out who's here, who needs to be here, and what else needs to be done.
Thanks, Ebony. All right, team number 3. You're up.
Hi. How you doing, everyone? Basically, the focus was with number 1, resource-oriented, mental health, food insecurity, refugee, that came up a lot, but everyone really agreed with housing, that we need to really focus on housing. There's so much lack there. And then also in regards to, kind of what the action team needs to be charged with doing, we need to not overlap. We need to not reinvent the wheel. We basically kind of all came together with really saying that if an agency is already doing something, then we need to really make sure we are connecting well with them. And that kind of spills into 3 with how are we leveraging it out. If someone's already doing something, let's just kind of attach and go with that. I know Felicia had mentioned about, again, with Ready, that they already have different phases that they're working on. So what will we be able to do to make that easier to move forward? And then Jennifer talked about like no silos, no isolation, but really being able to connect and collaborate. And of course, Hannah even mentioned concerning the Family Justice Center, kind of grouping everything together, that's a huge collaborative all by itself. It already exists. The partners are all like centered around domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, stalking, but there's a lot of overlap with other collaborators and groups who are doing other things. So again, she even mentioned learning from one another, like learning what's there and saying it again, not reinventing the wheel would save time and resources. So all of us were on that same page. And who else needs to be involved? Definitely the faith community and also schools. That would help if like more of them would come to the table and we knew who they were. Sometimes many people are involved, you just don't know who they are, but we need to kind of pull them out and extract what they have. So again, we're not reinventing the wheel and we're saving time and resources. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. I'm noticing the time. Can we hang for one more minute to hear from group 4? Do we have group 4?
All right. Hello. Sorry. Can you hear me now? So in group 4, we were talking about action teams that could focus either on a problem or a certain group. And we thought, once a list is created, we could choose from a list. We could also, of course, help to create such a list. Of course, a lot doesn't exist now. We're in the planning stages here. And so that makes for a lot of possibility. We acknowledge that, populations have different needs. Action groups that focus on this population needs are one way to go. We also talked about the fact that Guilford County has many resources, but they're not widely known. Groups could focus on that aspect. Also, of course, the group doesn't represent all agencies or services out there, but we can work to include those agencies and services. We were talking about the Center for Housing and Community Studies at UNCG. We talked about, obviously everyone agrees housing is a great problem. The Housing Authority, Housing Coalition. We weren't really sure of the all of the agencies included in these groups. So we were just thinking, out loud, brainstorming. Also the agencies like ADS that deal with addiction, agencies like Triad Health Project that helps people with HIV, and of course other illnesses also. I mean, you've got autism, you've got ADHD communities out there. So we see that there are many pockets of need and also some overlap. One of the things we talked about that we should not do is not to forget to talk to and include those directly impacted and the stakeholders from individual communities. We do definitely want to seek them out and make sure they have a voice in this process as well.
Fantastic. And that goes back to one of the value statements about being family-led and client-centered. Couldn't have said that more beautifully. Thank you. There are a couple more comments in the chat. Did we have a group 5 or were we were at 4 groups? Okay, fantastic. Y'all, thank you so much for the wonderful feedback. We will summarize this and get this back to the groups before our next meeting. And why don't we move to the next slide just to wrap up, if that's possible, or I can just talk to it. So in terms of what's next, we're going to take the input gathered today and build out some teams and structures for your consideration as we move this work forward. We have our next meeting is January 12th. So it's supposed to be the week before, but we thought we would give everybody a week to get resettled after the holidays. So January 12th, see some thumbs up there, from 12 to 1. And in the meantime, there will be notes coming out to you and some thoughts given about the structures that you've suggested and some outlines of that too. Kelly, anything that you would like to add or change?
Nope, I think that's great. So hold January 12th from 12 to 1, and we'll try to bring all the pieces together and present some ideas based on what you just shared on structure and action teams that we could use moving forward and get ready to go in 2022. One last thing, Mel, do you want to do a save the date for the MOA in case people wanted to participate in that?
I can. Can you hear me? So we have our MOA signing celebration scheduled for January 18th. That's a Tuesday from 12 to 1. That will be virtual. So we will be sending out an invite and a little background information on that, but that is the signing with our partners, our MOA partners with the CRI program. So look for more on that. But again, that's January 18th at 12 o'clock and it will be virtual. So look forward to seeing you the 12th and then again, hopefully on the 18th.
I think that's a wrap, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful work today and have a wonderful holiday season. Look for notes from us and we'll be back in touch shortly. Happy December and by the next time we see you, it'll be a happy new year. And here's to a great season of reflection and goodness for each of you. Thanks for all you do.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye.